Well, welcome everybody. I hope you are doing well today. I hope you've been praying for the rain to go away. If you haven't, would you start now, please? So we can have a nice dry evening tonight as we come back together and invite our neighbors to come and enjoy a fireworks show. And as of right now, we are still on, okay? The weather looks like it's going to, there's a possibility, depending on what weather app you're looking at. So we're just looking at the positive ones, okay? And so we're not going to look at the negative ones. Before we get started, though, I wanted to... We've been talking about shirts, ordering some new shirts, and we have some order forms, and we hinted a few weeks, last couple of weeks, that we have a new logo design, or at least a refreshed logo design, and so I want to show you that now. And so this is, we got a couple slides. We'll show the other one first, John, if you don't mind. So this is the sort of refreshed logo. There is going to be a few little minor changes as far as textiles and all that kind of stuff, but we wanted you guys to see what is going to go on the new shirts, okay? And so as you can see, we've kept the sort of basic design of our logo as it's been for many years, but we have refreshed it and made it a little bit simpler, but then also a little bit cleaner as well. And super excited about this logo, and super excited about the opportunity for us to order some new shirts and get people wearing our shirts. I know some of you still wear your shirts you've had for a long time. Andrew is one of them, and they're starting to fade pretty bad, and they're probably getting a little ratty. And for mine, they keep shrinking in the wash every time. I don't know what's going on with them, but they keep shrinking in the wash. But we need some new shirts because we need stuff to wear. But really, our desire is to get our name and get our image out there for people to know about East Hartford. People in our community know about East Hartford, but we want to continue to let them know about East Hartford. And so as you can see, our logo, you can go to the next slide, back to that other slide. Here's a couple alternative looks that we'll be playing around with as well. But this is an opportunity for us to kind of refresh and to get our logo back out there. That's not who we are, but it represents who we are in our community. And so we would encourage you, buy shirts. This is not a fundraiser, okay? So we're not making a lot of money off of these shirts. Actually, we're not making any money off of these shirts. We're selling them basically for what we're putting into them. And so the shirts are what the shirts are. And so there's a lot of options out there. I think you can get athletic style shirts, you can get t-shirts, you can get sweatshirts, you can get all kinds of different types of shirts. And so grab one of those order forms. I think the date on there is past, I believe, but don't worry about that. Just the links have been fixed. The links on the sheet have been fixed as well, so those links should work. So make sure you sign up. Make sure to get some of those shirts, okay? Now, Johnny, I don't think you got the updated PowerPoint. Is there a picture? Okay, so there's an updated PowerPoint. It might still be on the website, but nonetheless. So let me set the scene, okay? There's a picture that I was going to show, and this picture is a picture of a front porch, and it's a picture of my neighbor's front porch. And so I should tell you, we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 1 today. If you aren't already turned there, you should turn to 2 Samuel chapter 1. We have transitioned from 1 Samuel and now are making our way into 2 Samuel. We're really going to be between, mostly we're going to focus our attention on chapter 1 today, but we'll also be some looking back in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel as well. But I would encourage you to turn your Bibles there so you can see and have the Word in front of you. But this porch that you don't see right now, but you can imagine in your head, and if you want to see this porch, you can drive by my house. It's the one right next to it. This porch, it probably doesn't mean anything to any of you particularly. But to us, to the Robinson family, it represents grief. See, 2 weeks ago, today actually, a lady named Miss Ann, our neighbor, had a heart attack. And she ended up, by the end of a couple Sundays ago, she ended up in the Owensboro Hospital waiting on a stent procedure that would take place the following Thursday. We went to visit her on that Tuesday. I found out from her son, who lives in the duplex next to her, I found out from her son that, oh, there's the picture. That's Miss Ann's, that porch. But I found out from her son that she had had a heart attack on Monday, and then Tuesday I went in the morning and saw Miss Ann at the Owensboro Hospital, and then Pam and the girls went in the afternoon. And when we saw her, man, it was awesome. She was lively and happy and ready to go home. She told the girls once she gets home, she wants to hear them playing in the pool and yell at her so that she knows that they're back there. And so we were planning on Miss Ann coming back. And the thing about Miss Ann, she sat on her porch a lot. If you've ever driven by her house, and if you know where we live on Clay Street, and you can, if you drove by Miss Ann's house, more than likely she was sitting on the porch like 90% of the time, even late at night and early in the morning. I'm like, did you ever sleep? But nonetheless, Miss Ann sat on her porch a lot, and we come and go from our house quite a bit as well, like a lot of times during the day. And it was never fail, unless she was on the phone or not paying attention, it would never fail that when we passed Miss Ann, she would always wave, and we would always say, "Hey, Miss Ann," and it was always this exchange of pleasantries, if you will. So a couple Thursdays ago, she went into surgery, and the surgery didn't go well. And Miss Ann died 2 weeks ago Friday. We didn't really know her that well. I mean, what we did know about her for 6 years, we probably waved to her 1,000 times, but we didn't really know a lot about her. Actually, we found out a lot about her since she passed away that we didn't know about her before she had passed away. And I've lost people that I was much closer to. I've lost my grandparents. I've lost people in my life that I was much closer to than Miss Ann. But as I walk by this porch the last couple weeks, I can't help but be reminded of that smiling face and that thoughtful wave every time I walk by. So that porch represents grief for us as a family. And grief really is a part of life, right? It's a really crummy part of life, but it's one nonetheless. So it's no surprise that grief is included in the life story of David, to help us understand and navigate through grief with a godly perspective. I think that's why God includes this story, includes the vivid details of this story. Because he wants us to understand, and as we talked about, David's life is not a life to model our lives after, but rather it's a life that takes that sort of encompasses and shows up and illustrates life of the human life in general. And so, of course, he would include grief. And this isn't the only circumstance of grief in David's life that he records, but this is the first of what ultimately would be many. C.S. Lewis, one of the greatest Christian authors in history, wrote a book about grief. It's actually one of his last, and it was called A Grief Observed. And he uses, in the title, he uses the word grief as a noun, like a grief observed. It was written in stages as he grieved the death of his beloved wife, Joy. They were only married for like 3 years, and he had already known each other for less than, I think it was 8 years they had known each other. And yet, when she passed away, he was left with profound grief. And over the course of several months, he had written out, as he was going through these stages of grief, he had written out these thoughts. And he actually originally published the work under a pseudonym because he didn't want people to know it was him. And so after he published it, there were several people that actually referred him to the book. Hey, C.S. Lewis, you need to read this book, this author, and come to find out later on after he passed that it was actually him that wrote it. And I love the title because Lewis understood that grief isn't just this general idea, this emotion. But grief is an individual journey. And if those who have gone through grief, and if you haven't, you will, and some of you are going through it right now, but you understand that very keenly, that grief is not just this general idea. Grief is an individual journey. It can be a corporate journey, too. It can be a familiar journey as we as people go through grief together. But it's an individual journey. It is not just this general concept. It is a journey. And so this book is a view inside the mind and the heart. This book, A Grief Observed, is a view inside the mind and the heart of someone grieving. It's a grief observed. So in 2 Samuel chapter 1, in many ways, is David's super condensed version of Lewis's work, A Grief Observed. We get to observe David's grief of the death of a man that he loved like a brother, and a man who he loved like a father, yet was quite a complicated relationship. I think this passage has deep significance in the whole story of David. Obviously, in the story of David, this is not necessarily a story just about grief. This is a transitional story. In 1 Samuel chapter 31, we hear the recorded death of King Saul and his sons, and the end of King Saul's reign as the ruler in Israel. And this is an important historic event, because the first man who God had given over the kingship to was dead, and all of his sons, all the heirs, were also dead. And so this was the end of a kingdom. And then 2 Samuel chapter 1 is the beginning of a new kingdom. Now, the journey to that throne is a long journey. We'll find out next week as we dive into the rest of the next chapters of 2 Samuel. But I think the author doesn't record this event in a bland and basic historical way. He could have just said King Saul died and King David took over. That's how he could have. Or King Saul died and a messenger was sent to David to tell him, and then David began the process of becoming the king in Jerusalem, in Israel. But that's not how he records it. No, it rather is a raw, genuine, passionate recording of David hearing about the loss of his son, or his father, or his brother, and this man who in some ways was like a father figure to him. And it includes a deeply emotional lament of David in the end of this chapter that I want to look at today. So I think it's fitting, as we look at this passage, not to look at it just as a historical event, but to pause and take a moment to dwell on grief observed in our friend David. So to briefly catch us up on the story, and I mean briefly catch us up on the story, we know that Saul became the first king of Israel early on in 1 Samuel. The people demanded the prophet Samuel raise up a king to rule over them like all the other nations, one that would protect them from their enemies and secure the prosperity of the land. And Saul, as we remember, is a strong, confident leader. He's the obvious choice for a king, but he wasn't always the wisest and definitely wasn't always the most faithful to the Lord. After several significant mess-ups, God abandoned Saul and chose David as his replacement. But that transition wasn't immediate. It took 15 years. And a lot of struggle and a lot of strife for David, and really Saul as well. At the end of 1 Samuel, David is living behind the enemy lines in the land of the Philistines, and war is about to break out. In chapter 28, Saul, in desperation, faces the biggest battle of his reign. He goes to a medium in Endor and asks her to bring up the spirit of Samuel so that he can get some advice on what to do about the impending war with the Philistines. We find out in Samuel chapter 28 that the now spirit of Samuel, who has already passed, is brought up, and his words to Saul are not what he wanted to hear. He will lose the war, and he will lose his life. Samuel's words become reality in chapter 31. The Philistines destroy the Israelite armies and go after Saul and his sons, killing all of his sons and wounding Saul with arrows to the point that he's nearly dead. In order not to face a slow and painful death by the Philistines, Saul first asks his armor bearer if he will take him out. Would you kill me so I don't have to face the impending Philistines coming and torturing me to death, basically? But the armor bearer refuses, and Saul, it says, that falls on his own sword. And by the end of chapter 31, he and all of his sons are dead, just as Samuel had said. And so now we have 2 Samuel chapter 1. It says, after the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed at Ziklag for 2 days. On the third day, a man with torn clothes and dust on his head came from Saul's camp. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David asked him, "Where have you come from?" He replied to him, "I've escaped from the Israelite camp." "What was the outcome? Tell me," David asked him. "The troops fled from the battle," he said. "Many of the troops have fallen and are dead. Also Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." David asked the young man who had brought him this report, "How do you know Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," he replied, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear. And at that very moment, the chariots and the cavalry were closing in on him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and so I answered. 'I'm at your service,' he asked me. 'Who are you?' I told him, 'I'm an Amalekite.' Then he begged me, 'Stand over me and kill me, for I am mortally wounded, but my life still lingers.' So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew after he had fallen he couldn't survive. I took the crown and that was on his head and the armband that was on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord." Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and all the men with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until the evening for those who died by the sword, for Saul, his son Jonathan, the Lord's people, and the house of Israel. David inquired of the young man who had brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I'm the son of a resident alien," he said. "I'm an Amalekite." David questioned him, "How is it that you were not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David summons one of his servants and said, "Come here and kill him." The servant struck him and he died. For David had said to the Amalekite, "Your blood is on your own head, because your own mouth testified against you by saying, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" David sang the following lament for Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the Judahites be taught the song of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. "The splendor of Israel lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. Do not tell it in Gath. Don't announce it in the marketplaces of Ashkelon. Or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the daughters of the uncircumcised will celebrate. Mountains of Gilboa, let no dew or rain be on you, or fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul no longer anointed with oil. Jonathan's bow never retreated. Saul's sword never returned unstained from the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty. Saul and Jonathan loved and delightful. They were not parted in life or in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxurious things, who decked your garments with gold ornaments. How the mighty have fallen in the thick of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were such a friend to me. Your love for me was more wondrous than the love of a woman. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished. As we learned last week, David had avoided the war and was sent by the generals of the Philistines back to his temporary home in Ziklag. So David had not heard the death of Saul and his sons, and Amalekite, who was with the Israelite army, comes to David to report what had happened. And he reports Israel's loss, and also that Saul and his rightful heir, Jonathan, and David's best friend, have fallen. David asks him how he knows that Saul and Jonathan are dead. This isn't something you want to rely on word of mouth. You want to make sure that the news is actually correct right before you start acting on it. And so did this guy actually see Saul and Jonathan dead, or is he just hearsay sort of thing? The man tells David a fabricated story, because we read the story in chapter 31, that's not what happened, right? David, or Saul, was not laying on his spear. He was hit with arrows, and he was punctured to a point where he was probably not going to survive, but he'd asked his armor bearer to run him through, to take his life, and his armor bearer refused, understanding how serious an offense the armor bearer would have committed if he had killed the king, right? But this Amalekite didn't understand that. And so he comes with this story of David, and he says, he asked me to kill him, and I just went ahead and did it because I knew he wasn't going to live. I think the Amalekite likely thought that David would be excited to hear that Saul and Jonathan were dead and the path to the throne was now open. He had likely thought that being the one to kill Saul might gain him some kind of favor with the new king. But this was a grave miscalculation, as David ultimately has this man killed for dishonoring the one God had chosen to be the king in Israel. See, he had came to David thinking that this news was going to be really great news to David, that David was going to rejoice and celebrate and raise this guy up to be like his new armor bearer or something to that effect, right? But the news of Jonathan and Saul's death did not prompt rejoicing in David, but very much the opposite. David was deeply and profoundly grieved. And he pours his emotion out in a powerful lament, a poetic expression of grief. So what can we learn about grieving from this account? I think the first thing we can learn is that death is unavoidable. Death is unavoidable. Remember back in chapter 28 of 1 Samuel, Saul was with the witch in Endor, and he asked to bring up the spirit of Samuel from the dead in order to give him advice on how to survive this war that was impending. Saul was gripped by fear. He was gripped by this reality that what he was going into was likely going to be a decisive moment in his life, and likely he faced death if victory wasn't in the cards, if you will. Not, God doesn't work in cards, but you understand what I'm saying. I think Saul was doing everything in his limited power to avoid death. And so in his brain, he thought, if I go to this witch and I talk to Samuel, Samuel will tell me what I need to do to get right with God. And at that point, it was just too late. Death for him, and the reality is death for all of us, is unavoidable. David had experienced a lot of death in his life. Up to this point, he experienced a lot of death. But it's something about the death of Saul and Jonathan. I don't think there's something about it. We know that there was a relationship there that was unlike any other relationship. The deaths of Saul and Jonathan seem to be the most profoundly shaping to this point in David's life. He's going to have some other deaths that are very profoundly shaping. But this death in Saul's life, or in David's life, was profoundly shaping. The death not only of Saul, but of Jonathan, but also of Saul. And death has a unique way of teaching us about life, doesn't it? In Psalm 39, we can read David's reflection about death as he thinks back on all that he had experienced. Psalm 39 likely comes towards the end of David's life as he's experienced a lot of death, but I can't help but think that David was thinking about getting that news in Ziklag about Saul and Jonathan's death when he wrote these words. He said, Lord, make me aware of my end and the number of my days, so that I will know how short-lived I am. In fact, you have made my days just inches long, and my life span as nothing to you. Yes, every human being stands as only a vapor, Salah. Yes, a person goes about like a mere shadow. Indeed, they rush around in vain, gathering possessions without knowing who will get them. What we hear in these words of David is a realization of just how fragile and brief life is. Now, David's likely writing this later on in his life as he's potentially even contemplating his own death. But I think like what happens when we face death, the death of loved ones or the death of people that we know, what happens is we start to look back, or we start to look at our own life, and we start to see that life is fragile and life is brief. But do we live our daily lives with that realization? That realization. There we go. Realization. Do we live with the reality that death is unavoidable? We have a lot of strategies to prolong our life, right? We have health strategies, and we have screenings, and we have diet plans, and we have medicines that we take to prolong our life, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what they do is give us this sort of idea or this thought that if we do these things that we're pushing death off down the road. And it almost be like as the more we take or the more we do and the more we work, that death is something we don't have to think about. That maybe we can avoid death by taking this pill or doing this strategy or whatever it is, right? Or we just all have a lot of distractions to avoid thinking about dying, right? I mean, we have work, we have family, we have hobbies, we have television, we have entertainment. We have all kinds of ways for us, even religion, faith can be a way for us to kind of be distracted by the reality of death. But David points to the absurdity embedded in those strategies and distractions. He says they rush around. People rush around in vain, gathering possessions without knowing who will get them. What I think David is pointing out there is just how easily or how we tend to live our lives in ways where we are short-sighted, not looking beyond what's right in front of us. But grief and death have a way to open our eyes and put in perspective just how short and brief and fragile life is. Grief teaches us to put life into perspective. The things that cause us the most anxiety and fear in our lives will one day be no more. The struggles of this day only last for a moment in the light of the promised eternity. If we can see and if we have received that promised eternity. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says, "For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. So we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." You can trace the life of Saul in comparison to the life of David. And there was something different about the life of Saul and the life of David that I think is embedded in the idea of perspective. Now, David loses perspective at times, but it seems that Saul lost perspective early on. You can trace the flubs, the mess-ups of Saul, and you can see what Saul was doing is he was trying to make things happen in his own life and in the life of the Israelites. Back when he's waiting on Samuel to come to do the ritualistic things that are necessary. I think it's back in chapter 13. The men are sort of getting anxious and starting to question whether Saul knows what he's doing, and so Saul takes it upon himself and begins to do the thing the ritual that Samuel was coming to do. And by the time he's done, Samuel shows up and says, "What have you done?" And Saul always has an excuse. Saul, it seemed, never understood that he was not the one in control. And his perspective was always short-sighted. And I think we hear in the words of David in Psalm chapter 39 and other Psalms, we hear in the words of David here that he understood that this life is short. And that educated, that taught him, that allowed him to understand in these moments to think differently about the situations that he faced. I think you can see it in the way that he reacts here. I think you can see it in the way that he reacts towards the young man who brings this Amalekite, who brings this news to David. He understood that Saul was God's anointed one. He understood that better than Saul understood it. He actually uses words in this chapter referring to Saul that the same words are used referring to him as the Savior, the Messiah of the Lord, who would later, the same words would be used for Jesus. And so David calls Saul the Lord's Messiah, And he says to this boy, this Amalekite, he says, who are you to think you can take the life of the Lord's Messiah? He understood David in a way, or understood Saul in a way that Saul didn't even understand himself. Death and grief have a way of helping us to see things for what they really are. Secondly, I think we can see in this chapter that grief is real. That might sound weird. Grief is real. Of course it's real. But if you've grieved before, if you're in the midst of grieving now, you'll understand that sometimes in our world it doesn't feel like it's real, or at least it doesn't feel like it's acceptable. For a moment, for a season. The Amalekite wasn't right in expecting that reaction David had to the news. He wasn't right in expecting David to be glad, right? David tore his clothes, a way of expressing the depth of his grief outwardly, the grief outwardly that was happening and he was feeling inwardly. And it says he mourned and wept and fasted until evening. I can't help but imagine, like if you come with this information from David and you're expecting him to celebrate, and then like maybe this, I don't know what time of day it was. Maybe it was like early morning, maybe it was mid-afternoon or whatever it was. But likely it seems to me this is hours of fasting and weeping and mourning that these men were going through. And this guy is like stepping back saying, oh, that is not what I was expecting at all. It's like 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. I thought by now we would be, like celebrating and rejoicing, and now they're still over there crying, and they haven't eaten anything yet, and I'm kind of getting hungry. He mistakenly thought he would be happy, but that they would celebrate, but that mistake cost him his life. David's lament then provides us with a vivid picture of what it feels like in the valley of grief. Look at verse 20. He says, do not tell it in Gath. Don't announce it in the marketplace of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the daughters of the uncircumcised will celebrate. See, when David says that lament, I can imagine David like yelling these things out in a moment of mourning, maybe in that season before, or maybe it's after the Amalekite has been killed. But David is reeling, and so he speaks out. Don't let the people in Gath know about the death of Saul and Jonathan. Don't let those people in the marketplace of Ashkelon, don't let them know. And all the while, David knows the news about Saul and Jonathan has already reached Gath and Ashkelon, but his words express something that we can all relate with. See, we know that they know because at the end of the book of chapter 31 of 1 Samuel, we know that the bodies of the dead are hanging on the wall in Gath. And so we know they already know, but what David's expressing, David couldn't bear to think of people rejoicing over the death of those he loved. It stung David to know other people didn't feel like he felt, didn't hurt like he hurt, and weren't weeping like he wept. You ever felt like that in the midst of grief? Where the person that you have lost, you feel it so deeply, and yet everybody else seems like, yeah, they're patting you on the back and stuff, but then they turn and they're laughing with the person next to them. And I know they're not laughing and rejoicing at the death of your loved one, like those in Gath were, but the fact that like they can just keep on living and keep on acting like nothing in the world is different when your whole world is upside down. You guys know what that feels like. I think these words are so healing because what we see in these words, C.S. Lewis says this, I think this is so powerful in his book, A Grief Observed. He says, I see people, and this is his reflection as the post-death of his wife, I see people as they approach me trying to make up their minds whether they'll say something about it, the death of his wife, or not. I hate it if they do, and if they don't. Do you ever feel like it's like when you have that person? Like I I remember when my grandmother passed away back in 2020, I remember coming back from the funeral, and I pulled into the parking lot. We had a meeting at church here, and Wayne Neal was getting out of his truck, and he saw me. And I thought to myself, like, I was ready to just, go into this meeting and just say, hey, thanks for everything. But Wayne, like, heads straight towards me, and he grabs me and he hugs me. And part of me was like, Wayne, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. And part of me felt so loved in that moment that he took the time just to come and love me. And I can feel those words like, how can you keep going? How can you rejoice? How can life keep going when I've lost something so special to me? Grief can often awaken anger in us as we struggle to see people living when death is so present in our lives. But then he goes on further in verse 21. Mountains of Gilboa, let no dew or rain be on you, or fields of offerings, for there the shield of the mighty was defiled. Not only people, but even life in general seems to maliciously continue as if nothing extraordinary has happened. David cries out to the mountains, the dew and the rain, to stop, and they just won't stop. The sun rises, the sun sets. The rain comes, the rain goes. Time keeps going. The calendar days keep going. I was reading a post from a few months ago. A friend of ours who passed away back in 2021. He was only 32 years old, and his wife, it was her birthday, and she was talking about how complicated grief is, and how complicated things like her birthday is, because she is so excited to see her kids grow up and to see all to have experiences of people reaching out to her and saying happy birthday and all that kind of stuff, and yet she says, with every day I'm reminded of how distant my life with him is now. And she made this comment that has really stuck with me. She said, I love to take pictures of my kids, but with every picture I take on my camera roll on her phone, the pictures of him grow further and further away. And that's, I think, an expression of how, like, grief can cause it. Like, we grieve not only only the loss of that. We grieve because, like, because life keeps going, even though it seems like our life has kind of taken a pause. The reality of grief isn't something very well understood in our culture either, right? Because funeral services happen within days of a death. People come to visit, make phone calls, and send food for the first few days. Then life for them moves on. But for those of us who have lost are reminded of the absence and the pain in almost every seemingly ordinary moment. One of the most powerful things about this passage is the commonality of grief David expresses. He says in words what we feel in our hearts and often don't have the words to say. It's a reminder that grief is real and we have permission to walk in it. More than 3,000 years ago, David wrote these words. And today, we feel them. The last thing I think we can see and learn about grief in this is that people are valuable. People are valuable. All people are valuable in some way. And this is a hard lesson for us to learn, but it's a lesson that we need to hear. Something pretty profound happens in the next few verses of this lament. David actually honors Saul and calls the people to mourn with him. This is profound because for the past 15 years, Saul has been chasing David throughout all of Israel in order to kill him and keep him from taking the throne. He has thrown spears at his head, sent regiments of troops after him, and even given his wife to another man. And yet David honors Saul. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with luxurious things, who decked your garments with gold ornaments. What are you doing, David? This man is the man that has caused your last 15 years to be horrible. Who now, you're saying this from an encampment in Ziklag that's in the land of the Philistines, running away from this man. But David teaches us an important lesson here. He teaches us that God uses people to shape us, all people, even the complicated ones. Complicated relationships are still influential relationships. See, here is the lesson I think we can learn from this. There are people in your life who have hurt you, who have scarred you, and who haven't been to you what they should have been. Have treated you in ways that have truly hurt you. But God, in His divine wisdom and providence, has used those people and those events to shape you into the person He wants you to be, in as much as He has used anyone else. Beth Moore, in her recent memoir called "All Knotted Up," all my knotted up life. There we go. She tells about her complicated relationship with her dad. See, her dad was a church-going man, a hard-working fella. He actually did a pretty good job of raising and providing for her family. But when she was young, she tells about how he sexually abused Beth. And though he was a professing Christian, he never really acknowledged the pain and the hurt that he caused her. Even up to his dying day, he didn't really ever acknowledge or really genuinely apologize for what he had done. Almost as if he didn't see it as something that needed to be apologized for. The relationship was complicated. And so when she went to visit him as he lay dying in the bed, she tells about the struggle she had, the internal struggle she had of whether or not to hold his hand. It's really a powerful little section of her memoir. She says she's talked about how she's been in the room with others that have died, and she was not at all reticent to grab their hand and walk them through death. But there lays this man who she loved and hated all at the same time. And she reflected on her pain, his sin, and ultimately how both of those things shaped her into the person that she was today. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not telling you to ignore the pain and the hurt or to change it in any way, like you would go back and fix it or whatever. I'm not saying that or to lessen its effect on you or its pain. I'm not trying to say that, but rather to begin to see how God uses even the hardest of circumstances and the most complicated of relationships and people to shape us into who He desires us to be. And grief allows for that. Death, in some ways, allows for that. See, Saul had a difficult relationship, or David had a difficult relationship with Saul, but in this moment, David was able to rejoice at how God had used Saul in his own life and in the life of this nation. And I think that's an important thing in grief that allows us to say, yes, I acknowledge the pain, but I also acknowledge the influence. And to rejoice in God, that His providential wisdom allowed that to happen. On the other side, though, are the people like Jonathan, the cherished relationships. It's much easier for us to see how God uses people like him to shape us. Verse 26, I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were such a friend to me. Your love was more wondrous than the love of a woman. C.S. Lewis likens the loss of a loved one to an amputation. And I think it's a perfect analogy because the reality of their absence is felt in every step we take or in every time we reach out to grab something. He compares it like if you went in for appendicitis, right? And they take out your appendix. When you go into the doctor with appendicitis, you're hurting really bad. But when they take it out, you really have no effect afterwards, right? That's not what death does. That's not a good analogy for death. But what is a good analogy of death is if you go in with an infected hand or an infected leg, and when you come out of the hospital, you no longer have that hand or you no longer have that leg. Because with every step, you can keep on living. You can actually thrive in your life. But with every step you take, there's an acknowledgement that something is missing. With every time you reach out, there's an acknowledgement that something is missing. I think that was what David felt when he lost Jonathan especially. Because this man who had been like a brother, a father, a teacher, a deep friend to him, who had relied on, who had protected him and shaped him as a person, was gone. Grief allows us to more fully see how their life, their words, and their being shaped us. I think that's important for us to lean into in those moments of grief, is to start to see how these people shaped us. Now, for 6 years, I've probably had a handful of conversations with Miss Ann. I've talked to her about her faith. I've talked to her about our neighbors and how sometimes they can be not very fun to be around. I've talked about the weather. I've talked about her family some. But nothing super profound, really. But I do think that Miss Ann shaped me. And I think as I have grieved her loss, and in a different way than I've grieved my grandmother's loss or the loss of others in my life, but as I've grieved her loss, I think the thing that is missing, or not necessarily the thing that, but as I've grieved the thing that is missing, I've realized just how complicated we can make life. For Miss Ann, the joys of her life was sitting on her porch, smoking her cigarettes, talking to her neighbors, and seeing our kids with their faces usually smiling. Sometimes they're grumpy, but she didn't see that side of them. But see them running in and out of the house, and just the simple joys of life. I think if you think about anybody that you've lost, even the most complicated of relationships, you can start to see how God has used those people to shape you. And I think if we can gain anything from this passage, it's that. It's for us to stop in our grief and to see how God has used people to shape us and to make us into the people that He has called us and shaped us to be. But I also think it's an opportunity for us to take a pause and to realize, as Psalm 90, Moses says in Psalm 90, teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. Death and grief is a tool to remind us of just how short life is. We can try to prolong it, we can try to ignore its inevitable end, or we can embrace the reality and seek to take every day as a gift from the Lord, and to seek to take every relationship as an opportunity to love and be loved and to be shaped in the way God would have us to be shaped. A grief observed, and something for us to chew on as we think about it this week and dwell on it this week. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, I thank you for your grace, God. I thank you for the grace of your word, and I thank you for the grace of your Spirit who lives inside of us and who, God, draws us to you, leads us to understanding. And God, in what we need more than anything, God, is an understanding of who you are and who we are in light of who you are, God. Perspective on life, God, that only you can give us. And you use every person in our lives and every situation and circumstance that we face to help us to understand and shape, if we're looking, if we're seeking. And so, God, I pray that we would be people who seek, people who look, people who watch for how you are teaching and training and leading us. God, right now as we reflect and as we take a moment to respond in whatever way you lead us, God, I pray that, God, if someone here today needs to pray and God asks for your help, and pray that they would do so, God. If they need to come and confess sin, or God, just fall at your feet in whatever way, God, I pray that you would lead them to do that today, God. God, we thank you for your word. God, we thank you that your word always seems to provide us with answers to questions that maybe even sometimes we don't even know we're asking. Provides us with comfort in the midst of pain and struggle. Provides us with wisdom for the day, for the moment, for the season of life that we're in, God. So right now, God, as we reflect and as we respond, may you move and lead us. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.